What is going on, everybody? I hope you're having a great day today. This is Alex from the Fresh Fantasy Podcast. This is the 26th episode of Season 3. Today, we are talking running back breakouts, talking about guys like Chase Edmonds, Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, and more, and why we believe these players will significantly outperform their ADP this year. Joining me today to break this all down is the king of the East Coast dads. He is the creator, CEO, and mastermind of late round fantasy football with over 133,000 followers on Twitter and one of the most recognizable podcasts in the entire fantasy football world. Without further ado, he is late rounds JJ Zachariason. Welcome on to the show today.
What's up, man? 132,000 of those are bots, just so everyone's aware. The interaction is very, very fake over on Twitter.
That's so funny. But how long have you been on? Well, actually, the better question is, how long have you been in the content game, so to speak? Because this year you've transitioned more into your own brand, going solo. But I don't know if many people know. I don't even know if I know exactly how long you've been doing this for.
Yeah, this is my 10th year. I started in 2012. I published the late round quarterback ebook, which really allowed me to start going down this path and now doing this for a living. Been doing it for a living since 2013. It's been a long time. Like I started when I started, I was only like 24 years old or something like that.
Wow.
It's been like I grew with the fantasy space and like in the fantasy space as like a human being, not just like my content, but like, you're young too. Like you'll go through your 20s and you're doing it all on social media and stuff. And I look back and it's cringeworthy a little bit, but I just grew through, I'm a completely different person now than I was 10 years ago,
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting to look back on that. But I went from being like the young guy in the space to not even close to being the young guy anymore. And it's very, very strange to me. Like it's a very, very weird transition overall, but yeah, man, it's been 10 years now. And, this is the first year that I've sort of been out on my own.
Real quick before we get into the show, that I also have to ask then, what did you do for the first few years before, like right before you decided that, okay, I want to really pursue this dream? Like if you were in a different life and JJ never discovered fantasy football or never discovered creating content, like what do you think you'd be doing?
I don't know what I would be doing, honestly. So what I did after school, I graduated college in 2010.
Okay.
And so I graduated school and then I moved out with my now wife to Cincinnati, Ohio. We lived there for a few years. But I got a job in the ad agency world. I had a background sort of in like graphic and web design. Like I self-taught in high school. And so I did that. And like I got my degree in marketing. So I sort of like combined all that. And I went and I worked for an ad agency. I was a project manager. Loved the people I worked with. I loved the vibe of being at an ad agency. It's really cool. I mean, we had like a kegerator and stuff in the kitchen and stuff like that. And like people wear jeans to work before. Now everything's like super casual because of the pandemic. But it was cool and I met really cool people. But I just realized that I could not do that for the rest of my life. Like I needed a better creative outlet for myself. I just needed to do something more meaningful. And then I found fantasy football, which is not more meaningful, but it's a lot more fun. That's just sort of how things got going.
I love that. No, I think that's a wonderful story. Well, you started out as the ad agency, and then, as you hit your age 24 season, you started to really break out into something bigger. And that leads perfectly into what we're talking about today with these running back breakouts. So with that being said, JJ, we'll start with you because you're the guest on the show. Who is your first running back breakout for this year?
Yeah, man, I haven't been on this guy since he entered the league. Like I liked him as a prospect enough. Like he's a really interesting running back. But I haven't really been drafting him heavily in redraft until this year. I'm all about him. I'm all about Tony Pollard this year. And the reason behind that is sort of like 19-fold, but I'll sort of guide you through this journey as to why I'm on Tony Pollard. So I did a study on ambiguous backfields and how to spot breakout running backs in the middle rounds. And so I mentioned ambiguous backfields because typically middle round breakout running backs come from backfields that are more ambiguous in nature. So if you look historically since 2011, RB2s, so team RB2s in the middle round. So Tony Pollard is a team RB2 because Zeke gets drafted ahead of him. But middle round RB2s who have teammates that go in rounds 1 or 2, they never exceed ADP expectation by 3 or more points per game. I mean, it just like never happens. So, we've seen that in the past, like way back in the day, it was like Ben Tate and Arian Foster. But we still see that to say, Tevin Coleman to Devontae Freeman when they were in Atlanta. Those kinds of running backs generally don't pan out. They might have some spiked weeks, but they generally across the entire season are not great bets because they have a stud running back in their backfield. You can even look at Tony Pollard the last couple of years where yes, he was efficient, but he was also not someone who was exceeding expectation by a large degree because Zeke was a workhorse and he was being drafted as such in the first 2 rounds, first round more often than not. And so we see these different subsets with these middle round running backs. You have team RB1s who have RB2 teammates that are being drafted late. You have team RB1s who have RB2 teammates who are being drafted in the middle rounds with them. They hit at a pretty good rate. But you also have this subset of team RB2s who have RB1 teammates that go in the dead zone. And so that's what we have with Tony Pollard this year because Ezekiel Elliott is no longer a first 3 round running back. And I think the reason why we see these RB2s with dead zone running back teammates hit is because if you think of the running back dead zone overall, it's really this group of running backs, between, let's just say rounds 4 to 5 at least, but you can go into round 6 and into round 3 a little bit as well. It's really this group of running backs that get driven up in cost mostly because of supply and demand, because teams realize that there's only like 10, managers realize there's only like 10 projectable bell cows entering a single season in the NFL. And so once they get to like the 3rd, 4th round, those bell cows are out. They're gone. They're drafted. And so they panic and they get these inferior talents and they're drafting them and raising their prices. So Mike Davis is a perfect example of that, where he's projected to see last year, he was projected to see this massive workload, but talent-wise, it just wasn't really there. It wasn't this like superior talent. And you still need that from your running back, even though running back volume is driven by coaching decisions and them throwing them on the field. So the logic behind why I think RB2s with RB1 dead zone teammates, the logic as to why they do so well is because if an RB2 has a teammate being drafted in the first 4 or 5 rounds, and yet that RB2 is still a middle round pick, that RB2 is probably pretty good at football. Like he's probably decent. And there's been examples of this historically. A really good example is Austin Eckler when he broke out. Melvin Gordon was a top 4 round pick. He was holding out that year. But still, like Austin Eckler was good as a standalone value. Tariq Cohen is another one. When he broke out, Jordan Howard was a 3rd round pick. And Tariq Cohen had a huge receiving role. A lot of times you see these running backs as good receivers, which is exactly what Tony Pollard is as well. And so what we're seeing here is that same dynamic with Zeke. Now, I don't think necessarily that Tony Pollard is going to overtake this backfield and just be a bell cow for the Cowboys. But what I do think is, what we see with middle round breakouts often is that they have a disproportionate amount of touches that go through the air versus on the ground, which is what Tony Pollard is likely going to see. But then on top of that, if I look at my projections for Pollard, he's basically being drafted at his projection right now. And what does that tell you? It tells you that people aren't pricing in the fact that if Zeke gets hurt, then all of a sudden there's upside with Tony Pollard. And we've seen that historically with some of these RB2s as well, is that when their RB1 teammate in the dead zone gets hurt for some stretch of time, that also elevates them. That's another reason why these guys are so valuable. So I think all of that combined, Pollard being as efficient as he's been, he's seen more and more touches each year that he's been in the league. They're already talking about utilizing him more as a receiver. I think there's a lot to like with Tony Pollard, where at the very least, you're basically drafting him at expectation right now. Whereas, if something were to happen to Zeke, I know he's stayed healthy throughout his career, or at least he's played through injury. But if something were to happen to Zeke, then Pollard, the question I always pose is, if Ezekiel Elliott wasn't part of this backfield, where would Tony Pollard get drafted right now? And the answer is probably the 2nd round. Like he'd probably be a 2nd round pick in fantasy. And so that's the kind of value that you'd be getting if Zeke does indeed get hurt.
I love that. I think that's super interesting with Pollard. I think this is also a perfect situation for him to finally get more targets because, not like Amari Cooper's commanding that many targets. He never had more than 22%, but, there's still 32% of the targets in this offense I think are up for grabs. And that doesn't include the fact that Michael Gallup will probably miss the first 6 weeks and that they said, that Pollard's going to line up more in the slot. They're going to play him in the passing game. So I think that, like you said, that he's a guy that already has standalone value with a lot more upside should something happen to Zeke. And my next guy, or my first guy rather, is in something a little bit similar, maybe not as clear of a path as Tony Pollard to, touches because he's a rookie, but someone that also is in a similar really great offense that if something happened to the starter, he could be at an absolute star, and that's Rashad White. And the biggest thing I love about Rashad White is because he's playing with the Tampa Bay Bucks, he's playing with Tom Brady, but Rashad White has been in some pretty elite company in a number of metrics. So in his senior season last year, he had 90 rush yards per game and over 40 receiving yards per game. And the only other Power 5 running backs to ever do that were Christian McCaffrey, Todd Gurley, Saquon Barkley, and Joe Mixon. And Rashad White, pretty elite list. Also, last year, Rashad White had the 6th best PFF receiving grade of all time. The only players above him, or 3 players that ranked in that top 4, were Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, and Austin Eckler. Also, once again, elite company. Let's take it one step further. Yards per route run, I think people usually like as a stat that's pretty predictive. Rashad White in 2021 had the 5th best yards per route run of all time. The 4 players to rank above him, once again, Christian McCaffrey, Travis Etienne, Joe Mixon, and Curtis Samuel, who is now a wide receiver.
Yeah.
I mean, these are 3 different lists of 3 stats that people usually will agree that are pretty predictive. And these are all things where Rashad White was absolutely elite in all of them. And I know that they're like, okay, well, Rashad White's a little bit older. Yes, he's 23, but he's still among the only players to be producing in these predictive stats with these players. And should Leonard Fournette go down? Well, Leonard Fournette has missed 3+ games in 80% of his seasons. So should he go down? Rashad White is immediately a running back 1 in fantasy football. I don't think it's going to be Keyshawn Vaughn taking the touches. It wasn't, Gio Bernard last year. He's only going to get older. I think it's Rashad White. Are you feeling similar about Rashad White, or do you think I'm getting a little too excited about some of these metrics?
No, look, I loved him as a talent coming out, and my prospect profile, my prospect guide, I have a model. He had an 85th percentile score in that model, and that accounts for draft capital and such. So it was almost impossible for him to be like in elite company just because of his draft capital. But he had a positive draft capital delta, which is a metric that tells you if he was overdrafted or underdrafted. Okay. His top comp in my model was David Johnson, which I thought was really interesting because Bruce Arians, who's still on the Bucs staff, he's in the front office now. He drafted David Johnson and obviously used David Johnson in Arizona. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the metrics that you mentioned, within my model, he had a really, really good receiving profile, as you mentioned, with all those metrics. But he's one of 2 running backs in my model with a best season total yards per team play rate above 2.2, along with a best season reception share above 20%. And the only other running back to hit that was Christian McCaffrey.
Wow.
So Rashad White is definitely someone who I'm high on from a talent perspective. You just have to hope that the situation sort of morphs itself to allow him to get on the field.
Definitely. And again, Leonard Fournette's not getting any older. He's not going to get any healthier. We haven't seen a 27-year-old running back or older, finish in the top 6 in 5+ years now. So, if Leonard Fournette stays out of that, maybe he misses a couple games. We could see some big things for Rashad White. I don't think he's going to take over for Fournette, like I've heard some people say, but I think that he's someone that is really interesting, but maybe not as interesting as your second breakout player. Who is it?
Yeah, look, I'm going with Breece Hall. It's kind of chalky, but I think that he should be drafted. Like, he's mostly a 4th-round pick right now, and I think that we're going to see even in more casual drafts he could be a 5th-rounder, but he should be a 3rd-rounder in my opinion. He's someone who is in the running back dead zone, and that's something that is a little bit frightening. But I did a study this offseason on things to look for with running backs in the dead zone and running backs who emerge out of the dead zone. And really what you're looking for is talent. I mentioned that's the high level theme. I mentioned earlier that a lot of times running back dead zone exists because these running backs are being pushed up draft boards because of situation and not so much of their talent. Whereas the complete opposite is happening with Breece Hall right now, where if Michael Carter weren't part of this backfield, I like to ask these questions. I did this with Tony Pollard, but I like to ask the question of if this person weren't in this backfield or where would this guy get drafted? Because I think it tells you whether or not that player is talented or not. Right. And yeah. If you look at last year, Najee Harris had as a rookie, had the backfield to himself, and he was a mid-second round pick in redraft leagues. I think we'd probably see something like that with Breece Hall, if we didn't have Michael Carter in that backfield, potentially taking some of that receiving work from him and some early down work as well. But one of the things that definitely was striking and was huge with running backs who emerge out of the dead zone is that they're rookies at a very, very high rate. Year 1 and year 2 players, especially, half of them that have emerged and become RB1s in fantasy football over the last 10 years have been year 1 or year 2 players. And that skews even more towards rookies. I mean, we saw it with like Jonathan Taylor, for instance, where, he got started, he didn't get started off on the right foot, and he wasn't great during the first half of his rookie season, but he dominated the second half. And then we saw that talent really come through. And so I am very into Breece Hall. He was a 97th percentile prospect in my model. He can do it all. I really want to focus on talent when I'm drafting these running backs, even though, like I said, it matters a little bit more at the wide receiver position because wide receiver talent can really, really dictate how much volume they get because they have to get open and then they get targeted. Whereas with running backs, you would hope that talent wins out and gets onto the field. But at the end of the day, it's still a coaching decision. Like if the Jets sit there and they say, we want to split this backfield up with Michael Carter. Even if Breece Hall is way, way better than Michael Carter, it doesn't really matter. But you do have to hope and assume that he's a better player, which he is. I mean, he's an unbelievable prospect. Nothing against Michael Carter, who is fine, but he's not Breece Hall. And so I think that what we could see with Hall is that he's going to be a lot better during the second half of the season, which is what we typically see with rookie running backs. And if that's the case, you're going to get those really big weeks, those spiked weeks during the most important time of the fantasy football season. So I'm all about Breece Hall this year. I think that he should be a high-end RB2. He's being ranked more so as honestly, if you look over on like Fantasy Pros and stuff and expert rankings, he's a low-end one, which is a significant difference when you're talking that early in the draft. Yep. So I'm very into Breece Hall.
Yeah, me too. I mean, to jump off of what you said in terms of what he was as a prospect, Next Gen Stats has him of one of 6 running backs to ever earn a 99 overall grade from Next Gen Stats. The other 5 running backs were Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, Nick Chubb, Melvin Gordon, and Travis Etienne. Like, that is an elite list. Let's take it one step further. There's also only been 10 running backs in Next Gen Stats history to earn 12 running backs to earn a 90 overall grade or better. Every single running back that had this 90 overall grade, JJ, has a top 12 season. The only guy to not do it is Travis Etienne, who hasn't played yet. Every other player has a top 12 season. But again, let's take it another step further. What's the historical trends that we all know and love? A rookie running back has been in the top 15 10 straight years. A rookie running back has been in the top 10 in 9 out of the last 10 years. And a rookie running back has been top 6 in fantasy football in 4 of the last 5 years. Like, who's going to do it in this class? I know it's probably a little harder with some of the running backs. You know, it's not going to be Kenneth Walker or Damian Pierce. Like, it's going to be Breece Hall. Like, he's being faded right now. And again, he hit 44 targets in his last college season. Like, people are acting like this guy can't catch passes. I'm all about Breece Hall. I absolutely love him, but I also love Kareem Hunt. And I know that people are already like, Alex, seriously, Kareem Hunt? Like, this guy's like 26 years old. How is he a breakout? Well, I said at the beginning of the show, people, we're defining breakout as someone that will significantly outperform their ADP. And Kareem Hunt always seems to outproduce his ADP. He's been a top 20 running back in points per game in all 5 seasons of his career. His new QB, Jacoby Brissett, targeted running backs at a top 5 rate in the NFL last year, which is perfect for Hunt on a team that has 46% of their targets up for grabs. Not to mention that Kareem Hunt is going as the running back 30 right now in underdog drafts. He's going so low, he outproduces it every year. And to call back to JJ's wonderful analysis about Tony Pollard, this is another running back 2 that has big potential. You know, should their running back 1 go down? And we've seen Kareem Hunt do that in the games where Nick Chubb wasn't there. I love Kareem Hunt, the talent. I love Kareem Hunt, the player. I love that he outperforms his ADP every year of his career. And I think that he's going to do it again this year. So I know Nick Chubb is not in the dead zone. Like, are you still feeling Kareem Hunt with that, or are you a little bit more out?
Hunt is so difficult for me, and AJ Dillon is sort of difficult for me as well, for similar reasons, right? Because both of them have that RB1 that's going in the first couple rounds, and we typically don't see breakouts. And by breakout, I'm just saying exceeding expectation, ADP expectation by a large amount, right? So these guys can still meet expectation. Like AJ Dillon, Kareem Hunt, wouldn't be shocked if they still, I think that they're good values by the traditional sense of value. Do I think that they're league winners? I think a lot has to obviously go their way from a season-long perspective, like early in the season with an Aaron Jones or with a Nick Chubb, for that to happen. The one other thing that really jumped out to me when analyzing middle round running backs, and this is also scaring me off of Kareem Hunt a little bit, which is tough because logically I'm sitting there and I'm like, Kareem Hunt makes a ton of sense as a value, and I've still drafted him in like best ball. This doesn't really account for best ball analysis that much, because I'm really looking at season long numbers, not in terms of cumulative numbers, but points per game. But that's still season long, right? So a guy like Kareem Hunt, a guy like AJ Dillon, like in a best ball format, especially a tournament format, you're looking for that weekly ceiling that can still exist. So I'm not like fading them by any means in that kind of format. But the one thing that really was striking is I looked at middle round running backs and I looked at their historically by age. So basically, we've seen 128 middle round running backs. That's between round 6 and 9. That's how I defined it. Who have played at least 8 games in a single season. So we have 128 middle round running backs. 43 of them were past their 5th year in the NFL. And so that's 34% of this overall sample of the middle rounds. Only one of those players has exceeded ADP expectation by 6 or more points. And so it's kind of wild because basically 9% of the true breakouts in the middle rounds have come from this 34% sample in the middle rounds of these older guys. So the three this year that sort of looks at is Kareem Hunt, because this is going to be a 6th year, Cordero Patterson, and Melvin Gordon. Those three being the middle round guys who are consistently in the middle rounds. ADP is kind of all over the place right now. Sure. But they're in the middle rounds, and they're just scary from just strictly that age standpoint. And that's the reason it's like that. Like all of the ADP analysis that I've done says that Kareem Hunt is probably someone to avoid this year. But my head is sitting there saying like, okay, like imagine a world where Deshaun Watson actually plays 10 games. Imagine a world where Nick Chubb goes down early in the season. I mean, there's so many out. What if they do get rid of Kareem Hunt too? I mean, there's so many outs for Kareem Hunt still. So like, I'm not fully out, but I will say that ADP history is not favorable for a player like Kareem Hunt.
Fair. No, that's fair. I feel like if your other career, maybe what it would have been instead of the ad stuff, it could have been like karate, because that was a grade A takedown of my entire take. I feel like you put a pillow and a blanket down and you set me down super gently, but you still took me down hard enough that there is no way I'm getting up from that. So I love that. That is great data on the Kareem Hunt take. That is excellent. I have nothing else to say. I still like Kareem Hunt, but again, I think that is a good way to put it. I hope that he gets traded to somewhere like Atlanta. As much as I'd love to see Cordero Patterson get like 400 touches this year, I know it's not realistic. So I'd love to see him go somewhere like that, or even Miami, dare I say. Oh, maybe I'm coming from one of your picks. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh.
But we'll go back to you with your third running back breakout pick.
You know what? I'll just go to the Miami guy real quick. So I'm interested in Chase Edmonds, but I have to preface that I think that Edmonds is likely one of those players similar to a Kareem Hunt, even to some degree, who is a good bet to at least exceed ADP expectation, but I don't know if the ceiling is necessarily going to be there. I'm not like overly optimistic that he's going to like be this league winning player, but I do think that where he's going right now, he can jump up maybe 10 or 15 spots in terms of running back positioning, right? So he can go from being like an RB4 to an RB2. But I don't know if the ceiling's there, but let me at least like just talk about why I think Chase Edmonds is decent. Obviously, he signed a pretty lucrative deal with the Dolphins, that 2-year deal. He's making over like $6 a year. And compared to the other backs they have in that backfield, he's basically being paid the most, by a decent margin. Obviously has a good pass catching skill set. And that's one of the things you should be looking for with middle round running backs is, don't go after the Damien Harrises of the world at a high rate, because chances are, I mean, we've seen like a dozen years of Bill Belichick, and his offenses and his team's offenses, splitting that backfield up and not giving, his bell cow running backs on the ground, work through the air. So you want pass catching running backs. Last season, Chase Edmonds had an adjusted target share. So that's just adjusted for games played. It's basically a per game number of 12+%. He's had that actually over the last 2 seasons. 12 PPR points per game with just 2 total touchdowns last year. He's in a great system, obviously, with Mike McDaniel. We want ambiguous backfields. One of the things that I already mentioned is that we don't necessarily always want to draft running backs that have studs in their backfield. And you should look for that in the middle rounds, especially these team RB1s, which is what Chase Edmonds is by ADP, with pass catching upside. So, like I said, I don't think that he's necessarily someone who's going to exceed expectation by a really high amount. But I do think that where he's being drafted, it's below where I have his projection. And I get it. A lot of people see it as a situation where they're going to split the backfield no matter what, where Edmonds is unlikely going to be the goal line back. So where's that upside coming from? I totally understand it from that perspective. I just want to give sort of a different angle than someone like Tony Pollard, who I think has a lot of upside, or even Breece Hall, who has a lot of upside, as someone who can meet expectation, is a very, very safe pick, in my opinion. Could see a double-digit percentage target share pretty easily in that backfield. It's just a solid pick overall.
Yeah, I feel like if they paid him, over $6 million a year, they have to have like a big role for him. Like they're not just paying him that, to come in and restart Raheem Mostert for about 2 games before, something, God forbid, something happens. Yeah. But again, like I think that, Chase Edmonds is a good pick. Like I think I worry a little bit about what his overall ceiling is at that point. Like when I'm swinging for the fences, like does he really have that, top 20 type ceiling? I don't know, but I like Chase Edmonds, the pick. I think that he's someone that's super interesting, and I I don't hate the pick whatsoever. But my next pick, and I have to go pretty chalky here, unfortunately. But I mean, this is my guy. I think that he still has an amazing case to do this. I'm not believing just to believe, and it's Deandre Swift, and it's just historical precedent that my whole pick is based off. Regardless of what you think of talent, Deandre Swift as a rookie had the 4th highest fantasy points per touch of all time. The only players ever to finish higher were Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, and David Johnson. What do all 3 of those players have in common? They all later finished as the running back 1 overall in all of fantasy football. Well, Swift was also one of 7 running backs to earn a 6.7 or higher running back grade from Lance Zierlein, who's pretty universally recognized as one of the best running back graders or rankers, however you want to say it. But Swift is one of these 7 running backs to hit a 6.7 or higher grade. The other 6 running backs have all had a top 6 finish in fantasy football. Take it one step further. All those running backs have all had a top 6 finish by their 3rd season in the NFL. Deandre Swift is going into his 3rd season this year. He was also the running back 8 in fantasy points per game. He was a top 5 running back before he got hurt and ruined my Thanksgiving. He was also a top 5 running back in target share, receiving yards, and targets among running backs. And for all the people that are like, Jamal Williams on the field, like every play, like he's not going to gain snaps, like DeAndre Swift was 8th in snap share among all running backs last year. He was on the field a lot. And Derrick Henry was 3rd in snap share, and Swift was 4% behind Derrick Henry. Like, it's just the new NFL where these running backs are just not on the field at like 100% of the snaps like we want to see them. And DeAndre Swift is pretty much on the field as much as almost any running back in the NFL history. He would be a historical outlier if he does not produce in some way, shape, or form this year. What say you, JJ, about DeAndre Swift? And please, if you're going to take him down, just lay me down nicely once again.
No. I'm not taking down DeAndre Swift. I totally agree with you. And you want guys who are locks to see a lot of work through the air. The only thing that I would say, like the only potential downside with Swift is obviously if Detroit's a little bit better, and we don't see like these negative game scripts and these dump offs and such, or if we see a shift in target share. One of the things that I've sort of talked about during the offseason with Amon-Ra St. Brown in particular is there's this assumption that he was only good because DeAndre Swift and TJ Hawkinson were out, during the final 5 or 6 games of the season, which totally get it. Or at least Swift was, banged up and wasn't really playing at 100%. And I totally get that logic. I do think that it allowed an opportunity for a good player in St. Brown to sort of emerge and do what he did. No one's looking at St. Brown and saying he's going to continue to do something like that. But I don't know why the assumption is necessarily that it would revert back to an offense where the offense is running the passing game through a running back and a tight end. Why is it that would be the offense? I think that for Amon-Ra St. Brown, if anything, it's going to hurt Hawkinson more than it would hurt someone like DeAndre Swift. But the other thing too, on the plus side with Swift, is, apparently he's gained some muscle and such over the offseason.
Oh yeah.
And there's a chance that they just want to give him more work on the ground because he's a dynamic playmaker. I don't mind Jamal Williams as a player. I think that he's actually really interesting as just like a late round dart in a best ball format in case something were to happen to DeAndre Swift, knock on wood. But I wouldn't be shocked if we just see a lot more touches on the ground as well for Swift this year. So yeah, I'm all about Swift as ADP. I think that there are, there's obviously a handful of guys. Once you get into the 3rd round with running backs is where you start to hit some of these guys who you feel a little bit concerned about having that true top 5 upside, but Swift absolutely has that.
I know. Thank you. I'm glad you're on board. I was waiting for you to just come off the top ropes again and give me some kind of something, but no, I love that. I love Swift. And again, I think the case is there for him. And I think that, sometimes I get mistaken that, okay, you just love him just to love him and to stay on brand, and sure that there'll always be truth to that. But again, he has an elite case, but who also has a pretty good case is your next breakout player. Who is your 4th guy that we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, I'll go. I guess I skipped one of them. I'll go back to the other guy that I skipped. I'm going to go Kenneth Gainwell. I feel like no one's really talking about him that much right now. But I built a year 2 model this offseason. So basically what it does is it looks at a player's prospect score, which is proprietary for what my prospect model is, right? So it looks at their prospect score, and then it looks at certain statistics that they accumulated during their rookie season. And then it combines these two and weighs them appropriately to predict how they're going to do in years 2 and 3 of their NFL career. And so I built this thing just to sort of because I get questions all the time where it's like Elijah Mitchell is a good example where he's this late round pick. what does that mean for his future? Because he did perform well as a rookie, but should we still weigh him as a prospect and him being a later round pick into our analysis and how we feel about a player moving forward? And the answer to that is yes, we actually should to some degree. I mean, Elijah Mitchell's still fine, but what was really, really surprising was how well Kenneth Gainwell scored within that year 2 model. He wasn't actually that far off from Elijah Mitchell. And a lot of that is because, if you look at what he did as a rookie, he was a great pass catcher. I mean, he was top 20 in adjusted. So this is adjusted for games played target share for a rookie running back since 2011. If you look at his year 2 comps, I call them journey comparables, which is basically players who had a similar prospect score and then had a similar year 2 score. And it just sees how they, just finds guys who have similar scores, and you can kind of compare and contrast how they did in years 2 and 3. His 3 comps, they sound like not great, but from a comparable standpoint, they're really not that bad. You have Buck Allen, who is not a terrible pass catching back, Marlon Mack, who's had a pretty good career and he had some decent fantasy seasons, and Tony Pollard was another one. And so his journey comparables are strong. Miles Sanders has had his fair share of struggles, and he hasn't been a reliable pass catcher in that offense. The Eagles offense itself should be a little bit better. I don't mind Sanders where he's going, but I just think that Gainwell is really, really interesting as a late round dart throw because his profile is just really good. He was a really good prospect. You want to find pass catchers all the time at running back. It's always something that the market doesn't value highly enough is just general pass catching ability. So I'm into Gainwell. There's obviously a crowded backfield there, and that's why people are off of a player like Gainwell, but you just kind of buy into the talent. If you believe in the talent, then he could emerge.
No, I like that a lot. I like the player a lot, and I think it's interesting because from beat reporters, I guess, have said that he's put on like an extra 10 or 15 pounds this year. And like the reason that people didn't like him is last year he was like barely over 200 pounds. Like
right.
how can a guy like this get the workload? And apparently he's like bulked up a little bit. And Miles Sanders himself is saying, "Don't draft me in fantasy. Like I'm not getting enough touches." That's basically what he was telling the people because there's going to be someone else taking the role. Is it going to be Boston Scott? After he's been there for a few years? I don't think so. I think it's going to be Kenneth Gainwell. And there's this podcast I listened to one time that talked about ambiguous backfields and targeting guys in these ambiguous backfields. So by that podcast, but done by someone that's pretty smart. I won't name names, obviously. I don't want to call anybody out. But he said that target these ambiguous backfields. And I think that Kenneth Gainwell is one of those players that you can go after and target that is in a really good offense. I know the only thing that my only pushback a little bit is I think Jalen Hurts had the lowest check down rate of any quarterback in the NFL last year, but I think that talented players make talented plays. I think that Kenneth Gainwell is a very interesting stash, especially where he's going in drafts. He's a dart throw at this point. You're getting him in the last round of your drafts. If he doesn't produce in week 1 or 2, see ya. Welcome to the waiver wire. So that is that with Kenneth Gainwell. My next guy that I am very excited about, my 4th guy, I'm sorry, maybe I'm going chalky again, but I think this guy, the reason I put this guy on this list as a breakout is I think that there's a real chance that he could be the running back 1 overall in fantasy football this year, and it's Saquon Barkley. He fits the mold of the historical narratives of being the running back 1 overall. So each of the last 9 running back 1s overall were 25 years old or younger. 8 out of the last 9 running backs to finish as the running back 1 overall were drafted inside the top 12 running backs, and the running back 1 overall is not repeated since 2007. So by looking at ADP this year, that leaves us with just 3 players: Saquon Barkley, Najee Harris, and Deandre Swift. Obviously, they're just narratives. That's just what's happened over the last 9 years or so. But I think the narratives also point in his favor. I mean, Barkley has previously finished as the running back 1 overall. He's been on pace for 50-plus catches in every season of his career. And, I mean, the Bills with Brian Daboll as the coach were 6th in rush yards last year with Devin Singletary and Zach Moss. And not to mention, John Paulson of 4for4 did an article on this, and the most improved offensive lines this year. Number 1 most improved offensive line in the NFL is the Giants. They've always had a terrible offensive line. It's the best one they've had, the best coaches they've had, and Saquon Barkley is still is heading into his age 25 season. I think that he's really interesting this year. Are you in on him? Or are you out on him after a couple rough years?
I'm so in on Saquon. I'm so in actually. I'm in on the entire Giants offense this year.
Yes.
If you look at what's if you look at a really, really high level, a team level, teams who score so few touchdowns, which the Giants have had over the last 2 years, but last year in particular on a per game basis, they generally jump up and score a lot more. I'll bore you the regression talk.
Please.
I'll just basically tell you that historically, based on what teams have done after scoring as few touchdowns as the Giants did, we should expect them, just based on history, to score 14 more overall touchdowns this year than they did last year, which is a big jump. But think about why that happens. You know, if a team does really, really poorly in the touchdown column, they probably make some changes, right? They get a new coaching staff, maybe a new quarterback, whatever. And they had quarterback struggles last year with Daniel Jones being injured. And Jason Garrett is an abomination of an offensive coordinator. I mean, it's just like him being gone cannot be overstated. It is such a big deal with him not being there anymore. Saquon, when he was healthy before that injury last year, when he stepped on the defender's foot, he had 2 straight games after 2 really tough matchups. He had 2 straight games where he was an RB1, a pure RB1. He was seeing the kind of workhorse volume that we've seen Saquon have historically. I'm just bullish on the Giants offense this year. I think Brian Daboll can make a really, really big difference with this offense. And so, yeah, I mean, Saquon right now, it's very difficult to find a player going that late in a draft that has projectable, we're going to see like random guys come through and break out and have like fringe top 5 upside, but like projectable, like realistic top 3 or so upside. And a guy like Saquon, who at times you're getting in the early 3rd. I mean, he's rising a little bit, but it's just his ADP is just, it should be more so, in my opinion, like early 2nd, 1-2 turn type ADP. So yeah, I'm all about Saquon this year.
Yeah, and we forgot the small little fact that we could throw in there that he's in the 2nd year coming off an ACL. And like last year, he was like, after in his 3rd and 4th week last year, like he was already getting to like over 20 fantasy points a game over those last 2 weeks before he stepped on a guy's foot in week 5. And, that injury, the old injury prone, I stepped on a guy's foot. So automatically, like, I'm never going to be healthy again. Like I'm all in on Saquon. I love him. I love the Giants offense, and I love Kadarius Toney. Had to throw that in there real quick. But JJ, your final breakout player today, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say who it is, but I am a Patriots fan, so I'm excited about this pick and this player. Please give us your final running back breakout candidate. And no, it's not Damien Harris, people. Yeah. Come on.
Yeah, it's not Damien Harris. Like the Damien Harris stuff, like I was pegged as this like Damien Harris hater last year because I faded him. And look, I was technically wrong because he did exceed ADP expectation by 3 plays. He was a moderate breakout is what I called in my draft guide. So like, He obviously had a good season, but it took 15 touchdowns for him to be the RB20 in points per game last year. Like that's just, it's not something that's bankable, number one, but that's just not how you want your running backs to accumulate fantasy points. A little bit different in best ball, but regardless, I would opt for a guy like Ramondre Stevenson. Going back to the ambiguous backfield stuff, late round running backs do a lot better when the RB1s in their team, because obviously there aren't many team RB1s going in the late rounds. So they're mostly RB2s, RB3s. They do a lot better when their RB1s are just in the middle round, which is what we have with Damien Harris and Ramondre Stevenson. Stevenson hit a 50% snap share or better in 3 games last year. He ended up finishing as the RB2, RB6, and RB30 in weekly PPR scoring in those 3 games. He had a target share of 20% in one of those games. And not all of those games were without Damien Harris either. That wasn't just because Harris was out. I mentioned earlier, the Patriots just never give their early down guy a big target share, but Stevenson, who, looks like physically an early down guy, in college, he had some weird stuff going on where he was suspended towards the end of his collegiate career. But in the small sample we had in his final year, he actually had a reception share per game of 15%, which is really, really high for a bigger body back. That's actually the only reason why I was on Ramondre Stevenson as a rookie, as a prospect, was because when you can combine receiving numbers with a big bodied back, that means that you have the potential for there to be a pretty high ceiling in the NFL. I mean, we see that frequently, like a Leonard Fournette type player. There's at least that ceiling because they could see a lot of work on the ground and then through the air as well. I sort of see, with this New England offense and the way they might utilize Ramondre Stevenson, obviously he has a little bit of upside if something happens to Damien Harris, which who knows how they handle Damien Harris, who could be gone after this year. This is last year on his rookie deal. Maybe that means they really feed him, or maybe that means that they just don't, they want to start to use some of these other running backs, which is why I think they went and they drafted a guy like Pierre Strong, who, could take over that. Apparently they want to use him in that like James White role. But I see Ramondre Stevenson as their like new Rex Burkhead. And Rex had seasons in there and had stretches in there where he would see some red zone work, in that like 10 to 12% maybe target share range. And that can be enough for Stevenson to be an RB2 in fantasy football, realistically. You look at the New England offense, they had a rookie quarterback last year, and they were still 11th in touchdowns per game. If there's improvement from Mac Jones, that's going to help the entire offense, create more scoring opportunities. I just think that Stevenson profiles as a very good running back, and he looked good last year as well. And so I would rather be gobbling him up in more of those double-digit rounds than getting Damien Harris in those middle rounds.
Yeah, I love Stevenson. Maybe you're just reading my thread that I posted, from this morning. But Ramondre Stevenson was actually PFF's third highest graded rookie running back in the NFL last year as a rookie. Like, he was literally number 3 in the league as a rookie. He also just happened to break a tackle at the 4th highest rate in the entire league last year. Super efficient when he was getting touches. And the biggest thing of all is he reportedly has impressed everyone in Foxborough this year in practice. So obviously he's going to have a great year and take over if they're saying that. Obviously, if you can't hear the sarcasm in my voice, like, that does not mean it's for sure. But again, PFF grade is saying that he's doing it well. He's breaking tackles at a very high rate. And we saw him when he was getting the touches last year as a rookie. He was playing really, really well. And usually players improve in their second season. So I'm all in on Ramondre Stevenson. Another guy that's going into his second season, my final guy today, even though he's really playing his first game, is Travis Etienne. He's my final player today. He's, I know people have been comparing him to be Deandre Swift, and I'm a little bit worried about this foot injury, but Travis Etienne is going to produce in the NFL at some point. I'm going to say this quicker this time, unlike the same thing with Breece Hall, but again, he was one of those 12 running backs to earn a 90-plus grade from Next Gen Stats. 100% of running backs to earn this 90-plus grade have a top 12 finish in fantasy football. Once again, one of the 6 running backs to earn a 99 overall grade. The other running backs, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, Melvin Gordon, Nick Chubb, and Breece Hall. Travis Etienne in 2020, in his last college season, also had the second highest college yards per route run of all time. The only running back to finish higher, Christian McCaffrey. Travis Etienne also led the NCAA in broken tackles over 2019 and 2020, has looked completely healthy running drills in camp so far, and he's been described as potentially their team's Deebo Samuel. I know 32 teams have their guy that they project as their Deebo Samuel, but Travis Etienne is a guy that said he could be used all over the field this year. There's a lot of potential for big touches. Mostly players do not have a lot of success coming off these Achilles injuries like James Robinson is, and I know that James Robinson's a great player. I would love to see him get paid $100 million a year, but I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. Travis Etienne, my final breakout. JJ, am I going home in pain today, or am I going home scot-free after the last attack?
No, man, I love Etienne. Another dead zone running back who is year 2, which is another subset. It's not as good as the rookie subset, but it's a good subset to come out of the dead zone and emerge from the dead zone. Pass catcher, which is another big thing that we want to see coming out of the dead zone. Honestly, and I don't say this as a ding on and a slam on Deandre Swift, but you could argue that Travis Etienne is sort of like Deandre Swift arbitrage. Just Absolutely. The way that he accumulates points and the way that he should accumulate points within this Jags offense. And both offenses, aren't necessarily projected to be, top 10 offenses this year. So, I love Etienne. I think that the only problem with Etienne right now is his price is rising. Yeah. And so, that's the only issue, but yeah, I'm definitely in on Etienne this year. And
I forgot probably one of the most important stats of this whole thing with Travis Etienne is we want running backs to catches, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, Trevor Lawrence led the NFL in check down rate last year. He's the only quarterback over 10%, and he checked down at an 11.3% rate.
Yeah.
It's pretty good for Etienne. A lot of things in his favor. But before we get out of here, JJ, it's been a pleasure having you today. We still have one final question. The people that know you, which is most people probably listening to this episode, know that you're pretty logic driven. You're not really one for like the super hot takes, but I have to ask you, what is your 2022 flag plant? Any position, any player, your boldest prediction that you believe in? Please give it to the people.
Yeah, I was gonna go something with Trey Lance because I'm super, super high on Trey Lance.
Yes.
I'm prepared. I mean, I'm prepared for him to I have him ranked ahead of guys like Tom Brady and Dak, like right now just in rankings. But I'm gonna not go that route because that's just too predictable. Okay. I'm gonna go back to a guy I already talked about on today's show.
Oh,
and something that we basically talked about and alluded to. I'm gonna say Breece Hall's a top 8 running back this year.
I love that. You gotta tell the people why. Any small expansion on what you talked about earlier. A good way to, at least a way to sum up everything that you're saying of why he will be a top 8 running back.
Yeah. So I think like if you want to look at it from like a macro level, I wrote this draft guide, and one of the themes throughout the draft guide, because there's so many sections on like spotting breakouts and stuff and looking at what the market does and how to sort of exploit the market is what that's really looking at. Because I'm looking at which players and which types of players exceed ADP expectation by a lot. And it's basically saying which of them are beating the market by a good bit. And what I found is that really a lot of players that are beating these markets at all positions across the league, they're younger players. And that tells us that the market is just not adjusting enough for these younger guys. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, they want safety whenever they're doing redraft, and they just assume that these guys can't do anything as rookies or don't have these big workloads. And they don't always have projected big workloads, but talent wins out. And if you believe in the talent of these players, then eventually that will win out in the long run. The other thing too, that's really, really important. This is for both running backs and wide receivers. I did an entire episode of my podcast on the wide receiver stuff and rookie wide receivers, but the second half of the season for these rookies is typically far superior than the front half of these seasons, which tells you that not only are we looking at these season-long projections for these rookie players, but those season-long projections are also weighed down by a slower start because they're getting acclimated to the NFL game, and they might not be as good as they will be during the second half. So that's another reason to get a guy like Breece Hall, because once it's game time and once you're in the fantasy playoffs, and once you're in these really, really important weeks that are weighed so much more heavily in most leagues than the earlier weeks, that's when Breece Hall has a chance to shine. So I'm all about Breece Hall this year. And I do think that he has a chance to be a top 8 guy.
I love that. I love that pick. I've talked about Breece Hall extensively on this podcast, so I'm glad to hear that you are in on him too. I love the take. I love the pick. And I've loved having you on the show today, JJ. It has been such a pleasure to have you. Before we get out of here, please let the people know where they can find you. And, you might have hinted at this draft guide that has a lot of great information on it that the people can find. So please tell us all about it. Anything that you want to plug. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so lateround.com, you can find everything I'm offering. I got a Patreon, I have these draft guides. I have the draft guide, and then I have a prospect guide too, if you're still into the prospect stuff, even though we're like 3 months removed from it. But the draft guide is really just like, it's a PDF, but it's 160 some pages, and it's not player analysis based. It's a lot more focused on draft strategy, and really looking at the game at more of a macro level and a logical level. And there's a lot of studies that are in there. Because I think it's more important to see fantasy football that way before you dig into the player analysis stuff. You probably heard throughout this episode of me talking about these players that are breaking out. A lot of it, the backbone to it is looking at historical trends. And so that's what in historical strategic trends. And so that's what the draft guide is really all about. So you can get that over on lateround.com. And then also sign up for the newsletter.
I love that. I love that. I love that. I love that. But also for the people, they should also be checking out the Late Round podcast.
That's right.
You forgot about the podcast, of course. But the thing is some people that are listening to this podcast don't want to listen to me talk for an hour. They don't want to listen to anybody talk for an hour. But you can listen to JJ give the best analysis possible in less than 20 minutes on the Late Round podcast. I highly recommend you check it out. But one other thing I'd highly recommend is that you listeners go into Apple Podcasts right now and give the Fresh Fantasy Podcast a 5-star written review. We are giving a jersey away at the end of August, a current NFL player, any jersey of your choice. All you have to do is leave a 5-star written review and tweet it to me at Alex Caruso or DM it to me on Twitter. That's all you have to do. It'll take 5 seconds, and you could get a Deandre Swift jersey or a Chase Edmonds jersey or a Breece Hall after he finishes top 8 in fantasy football jersey, whatever you may choose. But that is all for the people today. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast today with JJ. Thank him for coming on. But as always, please leave a review. You guys already know what to do. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.